I'm KJ Wolf, a project manager at Huntsville Center. I'd like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker, Mr. Eli Pinhas, comes referred from the Alabama Holocaust Education Center. Mr. Pinhas is a retired businessman who lives in Birmingham, Alabama, was raised in Atlanta, Georgia by his parents who were Holocaust survivors from Greece. For 25 years, he started and successfully ran a wholesale jewelry business. After hearing the stories firsthand from survivors of the Holocaust, he felt the importance and necessity of sharing his family's story. He seeks to raise awareness and educate others to the risk of history repeating itself. Mr. Pinhas is married with 3 sons and 2 grandchildren. He enjoys helping people with their tax returns, tutoring Hebrew, and teaching both students and adults about the Holocaust.
Thank you for that introduction. As KJ said, my name is Eli Pinhas. I'm originally from Atlanta. I lived in Birmingham since 1977. I want to tell you about a city in Greece called Salonika, or as the locals pronounce it, Thessaloniki. It's a very beautiful northern seaport in Greece. Both of my parents are from there. My older sister and older brother were born there as well. I believe this picture was taken shortly before my parents left Greece. Coming to America was the dreams of millions. The Greek line passenger ship Nea Elas was a ship of dreams to thousands fleeing Nazi Germany. It was used by Greeks and other Europeans in search of freedom and a new life in America. My parents, 4-year-old sister, and less than a year-old brother left Greece on May 22nd, 1951. They arrived in New York on June 6th, about 2 weeks later. Their trip by train then took them to Minneapolis 2 days later. After a 5 to 6 month stay there, they moved to Atlanta, arriving on November 29th, 1951. The following June, I was born. My younger sister followed 5 years later. This is my family tree. I want to show you briefly. It's my father and mother in the middle, Morris and Matilda. You can see my mother's siblings to the right, my father's siblings to the left. I'm down at the bottom, right, Eli, and my younger sister to the right, my older brother, older sister to the left. I've included my father's cousin, Shelley Cohen, who's married to Heinz Cunyo, because I will be talking about him in my presentation. My parents spoke very little about what happened to them during the Holocaust. I would imagine that the horrors of what they saw and experienced was not something one might discuss with young children. Let me begin with a little history first. There are 3 regional subcultures of Judaism: Sephardic, Ashkenazic, and Mizrahi. These 3 groups originated from different areas of the globe, as you can see on this map. The 3 groups differ by their interpretation of Jewish law, pronunciation of some Hebrew vowels and consonants, some prayer melodies, holiday customs, and differing traditional foods, to name a few. The Jews of Greece, from which I am descended, are Sephardic and originated in Spain. The international language of the Ashkenazic Jews is the Yiddish language, which is based on German and Hebrew. The international language of the Sephardic Jews is Ladino, based on Spanish and Hebrew. You remember as a young child, sometimes your parents would want to say something that they didn't want their children to hear? Well, my parents spoke primarily Ladino at home, with some Greek mixed in, and a little French, and some Turkish. So mostly I had no idea what they were talking about. They didn't need to whisper. Since my cultural upbringing was influenced by the Sephardic Jews of Spain, let me tell you a little about their history. Spanish Jews were one of the largest and most prosperous Jewish communities in the world. Spain was the unquestioned leader of world Jewry. The Jews in Spain were citizens of the kingdoms in which they resided. They spoke their own language and practiced their own customs. They owned real estate, cultivated their lands, held public offices, and became wealthy while their knowledge and abilities won them respect and influence. In addition to these fields, money lending also brought them wealth and influence. Clergymen, noblemen, and farmers all needed money. But in the eyes of the church, lending money was heresy. Therefore, only Jews were moneylenders. Money was loaned at 20 to 25% interest, quite a high rate, but a necessary rate, so that the Jews would be able to pay the high taxes imposed upon them by the king. This prosperity roused the jealousy of the people and the hatred of the clergy. The king regarded the Jews as his property and used them to his benefit. Around the year 1300, there were about 120 Jewish communities in Catholic Spain, numbering around 500,000 Jews. Over time, jealousy turned to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism turned to revolt. In 1391, a revolt broke out in Seville. It was ordered that the Jews be baptized or killed. 4,000 Jews were put to death. The rest submitted to baptism as their only means of escaping death. At this time, Seville was said to have contained 7,000 Jewish families. 2 out of the 3 large synagogues in the city were transformed to churches. Jews were robbed and slain. This continued in Cordoba, Jaén, Toledo, Valencia, Palma, Mallorca, Barcelona, and Lerida, to name a few. Corpses lay in heaps in the streets, in houses, and in the wrecked synagogues. The year 1391 forms a turning point in the history of the Spanish Jews. The persecution was the immediate forerunner of the Inquisition, introduced as a means of converting the Jews. It is estimated that more than 200,000 Jews were converted as their only means of escaping death. March 31, 1492, the Alhambra Decree, also known as the Edict of Expulsion, was issued by then King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, ordering the expulsion of the Jews in Spain by July 31st, just 4 months later. Their primary purpose, to eliminate Jewish influence on Spain's already converted population and ensure they did not revert to Judaism. The short time span forced the Jews to liquidate their homes and businesses at absurdly low prices. Between 40,000 and 100,000 Jews were expelled. Tens of thousands died trying to reach safety. In some cases, Spanish ship captains charged Jewish passengers exorbitant sums of money, then dumped them in the middle of the ocean. With rumors that fleeing Jews had swallowed gold and diamonds, many Jews were knifed to death in search of treasures in their stomachs. The Spanish Jews who were fortunate enough to escape with their lives were known as Sephardim, Sepharad being the Hebrew name for Spain. These are the Sephardic Jews that I mentioned earlier, my ancestors. The most significant settlement of Jews in Thessaloniki, 15 to 20,000, occurred during that time in 1492 when they left persecution in Spain during the Spanish Inquisition. Others came after being exiled from Sicily, Portugal, and North Africa. These Sephardic Jews were the most dominant in the city and turned it into a first-rate commercial center. They excelled in the field of textiles, worked in the mines, and founded the first printing house in the year 1520. They were rabbis, physicians, philosophers, poets, and lawyers. The fame of Thessaloniki spread all across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and was soon given the honorary title of Mother of Israel. Pretty extraordinary for a place you may or may not have heard of before. Looking at this slide, you can see the highlighted area indicating the synagogues that sprang into existence after the expulsion from Spain in 1492. Many were named after hometowns from which they fled. In just 75 years, 19 synagogues were built. By 1891, there were more than 30 synagogues in Thessaloniki. The Jews were the dominant labor force in the city, and the streets were deserted on the Sabbath. By 1900, the Jews numbered around 80,000, almost half of the population of the city of 173,000. In 1917, a fire accidentally started in the kitchen of a refugee house. With overcrowded conditions, narrow streets, old building materials, oil, and help from the wind, the Great Fire of Salonika, as it was called, destroyed 2/3 of the city, burning 9,500 houses and leaving more than 70,000 people homeless. In April of that year, my father was born. Almost all of the synagogues were lost. Jews began leaving the city. In the 1920s, anti-Semitism arose again. People were forbidden to work on Sunday, which hindered Jewish businesses. Jews were typecast as communists plotting against the state. There were restrictions on the number of Jews permitted to attend the universities. The National Union of Greece, an anti-Semitic group, was established. In 1925, my mother was born. June 29th, 1931, arsonists burned a Jewish neighborhood. Scores of Jews were injured in the pogrom. A handful were killed. More Jews left the city. They moved to the US, France, Italy, Egypt, and Palestine. Still, in 1940, the Jewish community numbered more than 50,000. September 1939, World War II begins with the invasion of Poland. About a year later, October 28, 1940, Italy invaded Greece. Refusing to yield to then dictator Mussolini, the Greek army, with the help of the British Royal Air Force, repelled 70,000 Italian soldiers in a matter of days. By November 10th, the Italian army was in full retreat. A month later, the Greek army had pushed the Italian forces out of the southern third of Albania and vowed to march all the way to Rome. Mussolini's failure angered Hitler as he saw it his task to rescue the Italians. Some Jews fought against the Nazis in the Greek army. My only surviving uncle, Nathan Massarano, was one of them. While serving in the Greek army that pushed the Italian forces out, he spoke Italian fluently. Undercover, he provided secrets about the Italians to the Greeks. He was caught and sentenced to death. Before his sentence was carried out, an Italian officer asked him why he had betrayed their trust and divulged their secrets. His response to the officer was, what did they expect him to tell his own country when the war was over? His response found favor with the Italian officer, and his life was spared. He returned to Kastoria, a city in northern Greece, and stayed there for some time, as the area was under Italian occupation. The Germans eventually took it over in September 1943. Some months later, in March 1944, he was arrested there by the Nazis. The following month, he was transported to the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, then to the Flossenburg camp in Germany, and finally to Camp Leitmeritz in Czechoslovakia. A little over a year after his arrest, May 9th, 1945, the camp was liberated. Prisoner number 182065, a thin and frail man of about 33 years of age, stepped out of the camp and walked home to Greece. It was a long walk. It's just short of 1,000 miles. About 4,500 prisoners perished at Camp Leitmeritz. It's a wonder that he survived it all. His sister, Ida, and brothers Albert, Joseph, and Meyer, my aunt and uncles, were not as fortunate. Kastoria, where my uncle was arrested, had a Jewish population estimated at 900 back in 1940. Only 35 survived. My uncle went back home to Thessaloniki and married. He and his wife, Stedina, had 3 daughters, Ninetta, Ida, and Mary, my only first cousins. On April 6, 1941, the Nazis invaded Greece. On April 9, 3 days later, the city of Thessaloniki was invaded and occupied by the Nazis. Within days, anti-Jewish measures were implemented, slowly at first, then more and more aggressively. It was very bad. Within 2 days, the Jewish daily newspapers were forced to close down. Their printing presses were confiscated. Jews were not permitted to go into coffee houses, restaurants, or theaters. Their homes were taken over. The Jewish hospital was taken over. Members of the Jewish Community Council were imprisoned. Their offices were looted. Jewish archives and Jewish libraries were destroyed. Some Jews escaped from German-occupied Greece by moving to the Italian-occupied zones before the Germans took them over. My dad was one of them. He left his home in Thessaloniki and traveled to Athens, or the area around Athens that was still in the Italian-occupied zone. He spoke French fluently, which he took advantage of to avoid being targeted as a Jew and being captured. My father owned a paper factory in Thessaloniki with two partners. One was Jewish, the other was not. They put the name of the business into the non-Jewish partner's name in an attempt to save it. One day, my father's Jewish partner came in to report the German army coming into the city. He told my father that they needed to go to the Jewish Community Center to make plans for their arrival. My father was skeptical of the idea and didn't go. His partner went. As it turned out, after entering the front door of the community center, my father's partner was arrested by the Germans and put in a truck waiting at the back door. A little over a year later, it got worse. On Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, July 11th, 1942, all male Jews between the ages of 18 and 45 were ordered to the town square to be registered. Around 9,000 to 10,000 showed up to stand outdoors in the heat and perform humiliating physical exercises. Shortly after, about 7,000 were sent to forced labor, building roads and barricades for the Germans. Working in primitive conditions, many died of exhaustion and disease from being treated badly. The Germans demanded an enormous ransom to release the forced laborers, 3.5 billion drachmas. As the community of Thessaloniki could only raise 2.5 billion drachmas, the Germans demanded the abandonment of the Jewish cemetery, claiming its size and location had long hampered urban growth. A couple of months later, in December, under the pretext of urban planning, the Germans started destroying the Jewish cemetery, parts of which dated back to the 15th century when the Jews were expelled from Spain, and used the tombstones as building material. Survivors returning after the war found the broken tombstones had been used for walkways, to pave the city streets, rebuild Greek churches, and even to build pools for the German army. That picture up on the top right there is a pool that they were building. Very little of the cemetery survived. In February 1943, conditions worsened. The Germans issued orders requiring all Jews ages 5 years and older to wear a yellow star on their clothing to identify themselves as Jews. All Jews were required to register and issued special identity cards. They were not allowed to buy or sell property of any kind and banned from using public transportation. Ghettos were established in the city, and the Jews were forced to move into these designated areas by the Germans. 6,000 families were ordered to leave their homes on short notice, leaving only with what they could carry. In the ghetto areas, conditions were so cramped, as many as 6 families had to share a single home. Initially, they were allowed to leave the ghetto to go to work. Soon after, they were forbidden to leave at all, under threat of being shot. About 500 Jews avoided deportation by escaping to nearby mountains, joining partisan units that fought the Germans. My mother, Matilda, was one of them. One day, 2 young sisters, Ida and Matilda, my aunt and my mother, were permitted to leave the ghetto for the pharmacy to bring back needed medicine for the family. It was then that my mother, about 17 or 18 years old, told her sister that she was going to run away and not return to the ghetto. And that's what she did. Her sister Ida did return to the ghetto. My mom never saw her family again. She escaped into the mountains in northern Greece and joined the partisans in the resistance movement. She served as a nurse when she was with the partisans. She would come back into the city under the bogus name of Katarina to gain and divulge information for the Greeks. The only reason I'm standing here today is because my mother took that chance that day by running away. Some Jews could not avoid deportation and were placed in the ghetto and then transferred to the death camps. One of them was my cousin, Heinz Cunho, and his family. Taken from their large upper middle class home and given 2 hours to gather their belongings, Heinz, 15 years old, his 17-year-old sister Erica, and their parents, Salvatore and Hella, were relocated in a coffee house in the ghetto with a leaky roof and nowhere to sleep for 2 days. At 2 a.m. on the second day of their detainment, Heinz and his family were ordered to the town square where they waited for 2 hours. They were not alone. They waited along with 2,800 other Jews from the ghetto. On Saturday, March 14th, 1943, the Jewish Sabbath, 451 years to the month that the Jews were ordered out of Spain, all 2,800 Jews in the Baron Hirsch ghetto in Thessaloniki were selected for deportation. They were marched to the rail yard. The Jews of Thessaloniki had the dubious distinction of being the first community destined for annihilation right after the crushing military defeat Hitler suffered at Stalingrad. And he was going to make an example of the Jews of Thessaloniki because of it. The Germans forced the Jews to purchase tickets for their trip to death. The first transport of Jews from Thessaloniki supposedly was destined for Krakow, Poland. It was required that all monies be converted to Polish zloty. A small allowance of personal belongings was permitted to be taken, and each head of family received a check for 600 Polish zloty. Under penalty of severe punishment, the Jews were required to deposit all of their valuables at the ghetto offices before they left. The Germans spread rumors that their properties would be returned after the war. The reality was the zloty they received was counterfeit. The checks they received were counterfeit. Their property would not be returned. Where they were going, there was no need for money. The Jews were packed in animal cars and readied for their perilous journey. More than 70 people were packed in a single car with a barrel of water and a barrel for human waste. The first transport from Thessaloniki, with my cousin Heinz Cunho and his family, trudged slowly towards its destination. 6 days with nowhere to sit. Many died along the way. At times, the Germans would not allow the removal of any dead bodies from the cars, declaring that the same number of Jews who entered the cars must be unloaded on arrival. At other times, when the train stopped, the bodies were left alongside the tracks. The Greek Jews were located the farthest from the death camps, resulting in very long journeys that claimed many lives even before their arrival. Communication was hindered as they did not know the German, Yiddish, or Polish language. They were not used to the extreme bitter cold climate of the region, so foreign to Mediterranean countries. This went on for 5 months. Transport after transport. In total, there were 19 transports in those 5 months between March and August 1943. The Jewish population of Thessaloniki, some 50,000 people, were taken away. Among them, my aunts, uncles, and grandparents. Less than 4% of the Jews of Thessaloniki survived. 6 days after being loaded on the train, and 8 days after being taken from their home, Heinz and his family arrived at the camps of Auschwitz-Birkenau. As the train cars were being unloaded, the Germans yelled out their orders, but the Greeks didn't understand them. The Greeks didn't understand the German language, and the Germans didn't understand the Greek language. My cousin Heinz and his family, able to speak German fluently, stepped forward to translate. Families were randomly separated and often didn't see one another again. Those that appeared healthy enough to work were sent to forced labor. Heinz and his father were separated from his mother and sister. It was months later that he learned that they were alive. After being arranged in groups, questioned regarding age, physical ability, and health, the following message was barked out by one of the German SS officers. You have arrived at a German concentration camp and not at a sanitarium to restore your health. This entire concentration camp has only one exit. The tall black chimney over there and the dense black smoke coming out. All of you will pass through there. Under the premise of getting cleaned up, having a meal, and being assigned to work, people were led to their death in makeshift showers that were used solely for the purpose of poisoning them. Their bodies were then moved to the crematorium where they were burned. When the bodies piled up too quickly and couldn't be burned fast enough, large pits were dug where the bodies were dumped. By September 1943, Italy had surrendered and Germany took over all of the Italian occupied zones, and Hitler's final solution was underway. Still treated poorly, my cousin Heinz and his family were the only Greek Jewish family that would survive the camps intact, all returning to Greece after the liberation. Heinz's father was a photographer and asked one of the soldiers for his camera on the day the camp was liberated. He took this picture of Heinz. That's him on the left, tall, thin man, boy. After being liberated and upon return to their home, they found it to be occupied by immigrants. After contacting local authorities, they were able to get one room back in their large home. Over the course of the next year or two, only by way of bribing the immigrants who had taken up residence, they were able to get their entire home back. Heinz Cunho, my second cousin, is in his 90s and still lives in Thessaloniki with his family. Heinz devoted his life after the war to searching for the names of the more than 45,000 Jews from Thessaloniki that were murdered at the hands of the Nazis during the war. He successfully compiled a list of more than 37,000 names. Not an easy task. No computer. He did it by hand. A few years ago, March 17th, 2019, 2,000 people held a silent march in Thessaloniki. This picture is from that march, showing my cousin, Heinz Cunho, on the right, receiving a plaque commemorating the departure of the first train that took him, his family, and members of the Jewish community to the Auschwitz death camp on March 15th, 1943. The march has been a regular occurrence in recent years as participants join in and silently walk to the old railway station. Due to the pandemic, last year's march did not take place. But just very recently, since this was in March, there was another one. My cousin Heinz was unable to attend because it was bitter cold that day, and he was getting up there in age. In October of 1944, Greece was liberated. Growing up in Atlanta, some of my parents' friends were those from Thessaloniki. They had tattooed numbers on their arms. I was too young to understand what that meant. When I was 15 years old, my parents sent my older sister and me to Greece. We spent the entire summer there. It was an experience I will never forget. It was then, for the first time, that I met my family. So that good-looking guy on the left there is me, and that's my older sister standing next to me, and my three cousins on the right. In December of 2015, I was fortunate enough to visit Thessaloniki again with my wife, Sylvia. It wasn't until then, after speaking with my cousins, that I had come to learn how guilty my mother had felt for leaving her family that day for the pharmacy. She carried that guilt her whole life. She risked her life to run away and escape being murdered, and felt guilty about it. Thessaloniki is a beautiful city. Once a hub of Jewish civilization, today Thessaloniki's Jews number fewer than 1,000. There are a few synagogues. I visited the synagogue that my parents were likely married in. On the wall is a plate with some of my relatives' names. This one bears the name of my great uncle, Solomon Cohen. In the city square, where the men were ordered to report on that hot, sunny day, is a memorial. There's a marble plaque at the old railway station as a tribute to those that left there on their last trip. I stood on the tracks that took my family away. In the Jewish Museum is a room surrounded by brass plaques, floor to ceiling, of the majority of the names of the tens of thousands of Jews from Thessaloniki that were murdered, collected by my cousin Heinz. There is also a picture of a group of partisans in the museum, among them my mother. In 2014, the government of Spain passed a law allowing dual citizenship to Jewish descendants in order to compensate for shameful events in the country's past. Thus, Sephardic Jews who are descendants of those Jews expelled from Spain due to the Alhambra decree can become Spaniards without leaving home or giving up their present nationality. Portugal did the same. These words, written by Doug Kotler, put things into perspective for me. I'm standing on the shoulders of the ones who came before me. Today, my life is full of choice because a young man raised his voice, because a young girl took a chance. I am freedom's choice inheritance. Years ago, they crossed the sea. They made a life that's come to me. I'm standing on the shoulders of the ones who came before me. Thank you for your time and attention.